This is Conspirinormal.
Well, okay. We are here on Conspirinormal. We're starting.
That is Rob's vape. You know who's here when you hear
that. yeah, guys. Yeah. Well, he's been with us. If you're a Patreon, you've already heard Rob come back on the show 2 or 3 times now. But
Rob's returning.
For the main feed, Rob is back for this episode at least. And welcome back, Rob, to the
Thanks.
show, man.
Hello, everybody.
Yeah.
It is good to be back. It's been. I missed you guys.
Hell yeah,
we don't, man. We missed you too, man. It's a bro moment, you know.
You know, life got crazy for a while, but you know, now it's back to just playing my wood shop and chatting to you guys once a week. My whole life.
Well, that's
Hell
good.
yeah.
That's good. You know, you're at home. You're safe. Everybody's safe and sound. And we've also got another guest on the line that you guys have heard on Patreon and was on our 300th episode, and that's Joel. What's up, Joel?
Howdy. Yeah,
How's
this is Joel, and I got my buddy Chris Byrd here with me, and we have a band called Great Grandsun together, and yeah, we're happy to be here. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, man.
Yeah, thanks. And if you've been subscribing to our Patreon, then you've heard one of Joel's songs already. He's been doing some paranormal songwriting inspired by Conspirinormal shows.
Yeah, we got the Pitter Pat people.
That's right.
And now we've got the Sex Magic song is up there too. So,
hell yeah.
which is a little bit of a slow jam.
Hey.
Yeah. Yeah, it is a slow jam. It's for witches and warlocks to get jiggy with.
Oh, all right.
So we tonight, guys, we're going to be talking about music, and this was an idea that Seraphiel had, that we were going to talk about kind of music and the paranormal, and we're going to talk about conspiracy theories dealing with music, but we're not going to do all that tonight. So this is probably going to be at least a 2-part series, maybe a 3-part series. These things can get away from you, because I know Soraya on Where Did the Road Go did a UFO history series with Mike Cullen and Aaron Gullius, and that ended up, I think he only was going to do like 1 part, and that ended up being like a 13 episode series eventually. So we never know we never know where this could go, but this is kind of like we're doing the series on music and the paranormal. And so, Sergio, you had this idea to do this, and kind of like what was your thought processes in kind of wanting to do something like this?
Well, doing that show with Joel really inspired me to want to kind of explore this stuff, and it's great to have you guys on here, because we are kind of like the stereotype of like Nashville music dudes. Pretty much, you know, the way that if you grew up here, you grew up, or the type of people that Nashville attracts. You know, not just country music, but just music industry people who make their own music or in all kinds of stuff. That's just pretty much like our lifestyle. And there's a big intersection with the paranormal and the supernatural or spirituality, whatever you want to call it, the other, and music. So I really wanted to just get some like minds together and kind of talk about the history of the stuff, and maybe our own experiences and our own lives, and how you know, music is so central to our lives, but it's been so central to the history of mankind, and there's been this element to it that carries on till today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of fit multiple Nashville stereotypes, because I'm also a preacher's kid. And,
right.
Nashville is known as the buckle of the Bible Belt to a lot of people, and that's kind of where I learned all about music, is in the church. And from an early age, I was able to, you know, notice a lot of strange spiritual connections to just music itself. And is the reason why I think I kind of clung to my faith as long as I did, was because of just the impact that the music in church settings had on me at an early age. I kind of walked away from dogmatic religion in my early 20s. I'm 41 now, but I'm really thankful for the way that church life introduced me to just what a powerful force music can be.
Yeah, I would agree 100% with all of that. That was very similar to my kind of timeline. Growing up in church and, being involved in choir and various music programs, and just seeing the effect on people that it has. You get to that first hymn or whatever, and everyone's, well, Lutheran church, I don't know other churches how things roll or whatever, but everyone stands up and sings a song, and it's just changes the whole vibe, the whole setting, the connectedness of everybody, and it's a powerful kind of a feeling.
Oh yeah, I mean, I've even heard lots of people say over the course of my life that they weren't actually believers in the faith, and that they tuned out during sermons, but they showed up every week to church just to experience the music of it, which was fascinating to me, because I always thought, even though I recognized the power that there is when a bunch of people all sing in one accord for a common purpose, I thought a lot of the music in church was pretty lame. I was like a kind of a punk rock kid, but there would be people that I would meet who would just say something about experiencing the choir vibe, or a room of people just singing together, that would just give them goosebumps, and that's why they would show up every week.
Yeah, and I'm curious, which is a way to kind of quantify how much of it is, how much of that feeling comes from getting a big group of people together and that share a belief, and how much comes from just the way music affects us in general too.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure it's a combination of the two.
7 or 8 years ago, I sang in Les Miserables, a local performance, not like a traveling big performance of it, but I experienced the same thing. I was surrounded by incredible vocalists, and we were all singing at the top of our lungs, and none of the material was religious, but it definitely made me feel so similar to how I remember feeling in church when we'd all just be belting it out together. And the research that I've done for this show specifically has been so fascinating to just read about just the idea of frequency and certain tones, and when people are combining the voice and the resonance of it, and how cathedrals and sanctuaries are oftentimes designed for to increase certain properties of the resonance of music and sound. It's really it's wild how it can actually affect us physiologically.
I think that I've never really thought about just how important music is to not just a church service, but to any kind of a ritual, really. Music is probably the most integral part of that, of any kind of religious ceremony, any kind of religious ritual,
or even non-spiritual gatherings in general.
Yeah.
If you get if you're in a room with 6 or more people, and there's not something else that you're supposed to be paying attention to and listening to, if there's not music, it just feels weird.
Right. Right. That's a good point. That's a good point.
And all this popular music has its roots. American popular music has its roots in the church music. I mean, absolutely, there's no doubt about it. Without gospel and black gospel, so much of this music would not exist, period. I mean, just all the fundamentals of it.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, just the pervasiveness of the influence of music in terms of it transcending even racism and levels of people not wanting aspects of a certain culture in their life, but yet the music always prevails. From my research, it seems probably the earliest forms of music were developed in Africa and in India, and it was around the cooking. That the women who would be cooking the meals would be smashing nuts and stuff in a cauldron, and it would create a rhythm. They would have 4 ladies around a cauldron smashing the shea nuts, and they would take turns striking the nuts with these big mallets, and it would create a rhythm. And then the older women and the children around, while the men were out hunting, started developing games around that rhythm, where they would start clapping their hands along with the rhythm of these mallets smashing these nuts. And it's almost like rap might have been like the first type of music, actually, where these ladies in Africa were.
Well, let's talk about it. Like, yeah.
And the kids and the old women around who were too old to actually be up on their feet doing the work would start tapping their feet and clapping their hands along with the rhythm of these mallets smashing the shea nuts. And then over time they started doing storytelling and teaching the children their lessons while the food was being prepared. And so they would start developing these rhythmic chants along with the rhythm of the different aspects of preparing the meal. And
let's talk about, how far back does it go? Does this go back to, it definitely goes back to the dawn of man, but is it even further than that? Is it before language? Because animals dance, birds sing, did this start with us imitating animals?
Yeah, I think so.
Call and response is important to hunting and what the men were doing too. So, this may be one of the first abstractions. Like I know when me or you were talking, Joel, about like the stoned ape theory and things like that. Like music may have predated art on a cave wall, or language as we know it itself.
Well, interestingly enough, it seems like at least the oldest musical instrument found by archaeologists so far dates back about 45,000 years ago. And it was a flute with just like one or two holes in it that was made out of a bone from a bear. And and that's right around the same time that a lot of those cave paintings, the oldest cave paintings in France and stuff, are dated to.
Yeah, I'd say that's about roughly. Yeah, I think so.
To me, that lends even more credence to the stoned ape theory, that there was probably some sort of substance that early hominid came across and ingested, that kind of opened up the idea of imagination and thinking a little bit more abstractly about the patterns that the human brain tends to. And so that kicking off of visual art and kicking off of making sounds that follow patterns could both be the result of some sort of psychedelic experience.
Well, wouldn't the two kind of go together in a way? Because wouldn't you have, if we're talking, because I remember hearing some things about the Lascaux cave paintings and what was going on there, and that these were that these could have been part of some kind of shamanic ritual. Many people have said that. So in that case, you would have had the art on the wall, and you probably would have had some kind of musical accompaniment within the ritual. You would almost think that would just be natural.
Well, I think language and music. I think language and music probably evolved together along the same time too.
Yeah. Or language. It could have been music first, with these kind of imitative sounds, or just patterns of
I'm saying, it was sort of right, and various inflections or melodic stuff in your voice that we're kind of more attuned to now, I think sort of evolved along a path along with music. Like you've got, like if you're talking like interval theory, you've got minor thirds and major thirds, and for some reason one sounds sad to us, one sounds happy to us, and there's got to be some underlying reason for why our brains interpret these harmonies in certain ways. Right. You know what I mean? I think that probably it's got to reach back to the beginnings of language, which would also be the beginnings of our exposure to music as well.
Right. Well, then at the same time in those caves you have burial, the first burials. So that starts connecting music to something that makes it different from animals, which is in humans, music has all these practical applications, but it's tied up in the supernatural, spirituality, and in the other, whatever that is.
Right. And, there was one study that I read that I think was about 10 or 12 years ago. I think it was from the University of York, where they discovered that chimpanzees, who prior to this study, it was thought didn't really have much pattern to the sounds that they made. There wasn't much pattern recognition. But in this particular study, they were able to discover that for warning signals of danger, that there was a very consistent vocalized sounds that they made in those circumstances. Found that it varied to if you were trying to warn someone that was part of your clan, or I don't know what a group of chimpanzees is called, but they made a very specific sound if they were trying to warn those that were part of their family or their clan, versus the sound they would make if they were trying to warn a stranger. And that's really cool too, because it showed these chimpanzees, like if they were warning their family members consistently, that sounded a certain way. But then if there were other, like a rival group of chimpanzees, they didn't necessarily want the rival group to be killed by the poisonous snake either. And so they would give a different warning for them. And that warning was consistent for how it sounded. And so that it kind of had a melody to it, a slight melody to it. So that in that case, it would seem that would predate actual language.
And that's why I'm saying it. Yeah, I think that it does. Like in a lot of ways, it does, because there's there's certain inflections and certain, like in that example, certain melodies or certain even just like pitches and stuff in general that our brains naturally associate towards certain emotions, or certain, like with them, various different dangers. And I don't think it's something that would be learned for them. I think it's something that it seems more likely that it's like, if you hear this, then you just know instinctively to run. It's not like they were all taught, this is the melody you do to warn a neighboring tribe chimpanzee that there's a snake, or, you know what I mean? It's just, that's what causes you to feel that. So that's what you got to project or whatever and share.
So in other words,
it's like an evolutionary instinctive kind of just emotional predisposition towards these various frequency elements.
So in other words, you could have some kind of built-in instinctual, we could have our own kind of built-in instinctual melodies that we've just used for a long, long time.
Yeah, well, I mean, look at it. Everybody in the world hears a minor chord and thinks it sounds sad. Everybody in the world hears a major chord and thinks it sounds happy. It's not something that you're trained. It's just it's something that's been ingrained in us for who knows how long.
It's just visceral.
Yeah, possibly hundreds. I mean, that's probably an ancient ancestor of Homo sapiens that developed that. Which would obviously be long before spoken language. And
okay, so there's
oddly.
Go ahead, Joel.
Oddly, that does line up with actually like the lineage of like Greek mythology too, though, because like Apollo was like the instrument bringer within that belief system, and it was all just instrumental music. And it was actually Apollo's son who said, "Oh, hey, Dad, you've given us the lyre and you've like shown us how to play this music, but what if we put poetry to that music?" And so his son was supposedly kind of brought to humanity the idea of bringing language to the music.
So
it's kind of cool
so
to
with
see
that
correlation.
Yeah. So without a strictly evolutionary perspective, the other side would be, then, is it divinely inspired, whatever that means to you? And the fact that music has been seen as this gateway or bridge, no pun intended, to the divine, it's been used, in devotion to deity or supernatural forces, in ritual and invocation, since the dawn of man. So at the same time that you have these abstractions, we're talking about language and art and music, you also have the development of these spiritual system as well. That's what really makes us human. So like when did that begin? And it seems like it's always been central to the spirituality of different peoples, to their rituals, to the ways that they honor their gods.
Well, relatively speaking, it seems to have happened like not too long after, like, so that flute that was found out of the bare bone was like 45,000 years ago. And from what I read, it seemed like it was between 35,000 and 40,000 years ago that early humans started, like, I guess, expressing some sort of belief of a desire to communicate with the invisible. And to me, it makes sense that, okay, like going back to the stoned ape theory, it seems like you had hominid running around the planet for a couple 100,000 years before that flute showed up and before the cave painting showed up. But those two things happened pretty simultaneously. And then
it was pretty fast.
Within a few thousand years of that, we start trying to communicate with the invisible. So at a certain point, it kind of makes sense to me that, yeah, we discovered something that sent our brains into the realm of imagination. And I think it makes sense to me how psychedelics could potentially be that thing. But what's really fascinating to me is that we start off communicating with animals and about animals, but then at a certain point, a few thousand years into that process of evolution, communicating with the invisible, in my mind, likely had to do with like, okay, we've been trying to communicate with animals. What happens if we try to communicate with the sun or with storms and with lightning? And like, you know, you see the connections even with the Greek gods, with the storms and lightning and nature and the ocean and the waves. I feel like it was just an extension of communicating with an even more abstract part of nature than other animals, and being like, okay, well, we've learned to do bird calls, and we've learned to like do sounds that attract certain animals that we want to hunt. But now can we also use that same new technology within humanity to try to cause the storm to go away, or to bring rain to us when we're experiencing drought? And so to me, that's a very natural connection to how religion could form around that and the divinity of music.
So you're saying that essentially like religion follows music, not the other way around?
I think so. I think
that's possible.
It follows
Yeah.
language, communication.
Interesting.
I think we learn to communicate with each other, then we learn to communicate with other animals, and then we try to see if we can communicate with other things. And somehow that does wind up getting connected to the funeral process, like the
Absolutely.
death. Can we communicate with our family members after they die? Does the spirit live on?
And it's really death and rebirth, because what we see in the religious rituals and in the people who were tied to the cycles of the land is that real concentration of death and rebirth. So you have all these rituals with music that's essentially about bringing new life into the world through sexuality. And then you have the closing of the years and the seasons and the death of the crops. And you have that end of the cycle. So it really does. All these ancient religions really revolve around that. But music was really the way to communicate and to get people into, it seems like a lot of this really centers on getting people into altered states that allows them to call forth or draw down or feel more in touch with the other side, whatever that is.
Right. And any of us who have done psychedelics, I mean, I've done quite a bit of them. And, you know, the first time anyone ever takes mushrooms or LSD, you know, one of the first things they notice is how different stuff starts to sound.
Yeah.
And how, like, you can hear a song that you've heard 1,000 times, and all of a sudden it sounds like the first time you've ever heard it. And you notice all these different things about it. So, I mean, I don't, like, 100% subscribe to the idea of stoned ape theory, but the more research I do anthropologically and about, you know, the history of humanity, and trying to go back as far as I can, the puzzle pieces to me seem like they fit pretty well with that theory.
I am surprised that no one has taken that as a band name, Stoned Ape.
Theory.
I know.
Or just Stone Ape.
Either one. So, okay. There was something here that you sent me,
Talking about
Sergio.
Of course, the cycles of the season. Yeah. Let's get to it real quick in a second. But I was just gonna say, like, all the other things that the ritualistic element of music does, it also it heals people. It's part of those ceremonies. It's a part of all of shamanistic journeys, and the song itself is a metaphor for the journey. And so you just have it's so embedded in ritual and in altered states, in trances. I mean, we can't even really think about trance without thinking about some kind of repetitive music that gets people into that.
Yeah, I mean, as far as the people of ancient times kind of responding to that sort of thing, I don't know, but I do know there's a lot of more works for us now with the human brain, and how, like, you've got, like, you know, the right brain is really focused on the big picture and on abstract thought, and that's why it's considered more the artistic side of, and the left brain focuses more on intricate detail and nuance of, like, engineering and construction. And there are some things that have to do with repetitive music that seems to, like, even in people who are predominantly left-brained, if they're exposed to repetition in music, it can put them in a state that switches them from being left brain dominant to right brain dominant. And if you're not used to being right brain dominant, that can really open your mind up to a totally different way of perceiving life.
I think that's why I listen to music as an escape a lot of the time. Because I think I overanalyze everything. I'm a very left brain focused type of guy, you know, and you know, if I really need to escape, music has always been that for me. Like, it shuts everything else in my head off, and it opens my creative side, and it, you know, and yeah, I think that.
I think, is it because that repetition of time, when time is really put into concrete form, I feel like it almost warps time itself, like the perception of time.
Well, that, and it also, I think it engages various other emotional parts of your brain that just, you know, in your daily kind of doing your chores and going through doing the things you got to do and stuff, kind of, it just doesn't get activated the way that it should. And
I think,
you know,
going back
we
to
evolved. Well, we evolved in those kind of tribal lifestyles where music was a lot more. I mean, music is still a big part of our lives now, but not as ritualistically for a lot of us. For me in particular, because I don't go to church, so I don't have that weekly association with music as a ritualistic kind of a thing. So,
well, I want to get into that later,
day,
because I feel like we really are. Yeah. I feel like we are getting back to, I feel like some of the elements pop music are putting us back to, and like you talked about earlier, the group element, like, and how when you were a kid in church, you saw, like, everyone kind of syncing up. And I think that's one of the biggest parts of the ritualistic power, is that it really gets everyone synced up into the same time, movement, frame of mind.
One of you mentioned earlier, like, if you're in a group of more than however many people and there isn't music playing, it feels weird. And I think there's, like, an element of music being played and the repetition of a beat or whatever that can really set people at ease. And I feel like it kind of is a social lubricant in a way as well.
Absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
Like, when you're focused on the nuance and the little details of your social interactions, it can become a very paranoid experience, and it can feel kind of like scary. Especially, like, I have a lot of social anxiety, and I think that that's one of the reasons early in life I was drawn to music, because when music's going on, all of a sudden, when it clicks people into being right brain dominant, all of a sudden they're more big picture focused, and they're like, oh, me miss saying that one word doesn't matter in the big picture. I don't have to feel insecure about that. We're all in this together.
All vibrating on the same frequency.
All vibrating on the same frequency. So I think like music kind of like does what for some people like alcohol does. It lowers your inhibitions. It kind of makes you be like, oh, everything's going to be okay, even if that one thing I said was a little stupid. And so in that regard, I feel like it does kind of put people in this more of an open-minded point of view.
Right. That's what I was thinking. That's why I tend to do that towards the end of the day. Like, you know, I as part of my wind down, you know, it's just it opens you up. It lets you let go of all the daily responsibility stuff. And I think it harkens back to that whole uniting force, that kind of relaxing, that feeling connected to everything, kind of a vibe. You know what I mean? Where you're not on your own trying to trudge through everything, and now all of a sudden you're reconnected to the universe through, you know, just rhythm and abstract thought.
I wonder too if music and spirituality are both human attempts to reckon with that ineffable kind of void we all feel sometimes, and it's kind of a way to find communion with other people.
Absolutely.
I'm like seeing this, like when I was thinking about these African women preparing the meal and that rhythm of the mallets hitting the nuts, and I just can kind of see this story unfolding in my mind of like there being maybe someone who wasn't the best storyteller in the group, but sitting there and starting to feel that rhythm, and then all of a sudden, after like a few years of being used to that, hearing that rhythm, they kind of crawl out of their shell and they get over their insecurity and they tell some story, or they decide to give a lesson to the children, and they do it in a way that makes the whole group say like, whoa, where did that come from? You know, you're usually really quiet. And I just can see that when we're exposed to that rhythm, and if it does click people into more of a right brain state of mind than humans had ever been in regularly up to that point, it would cause people to start expressing themselves in new and different ways. That could be like a game. There's also like all this research that shows that when people study with music on in the background, they retain the information they're studying better. So they start noticing also that giving the children of the tribe these lessons while the rhythm is beating on the, you know, on these shea nuts in the background, that the children are actually learning the lessons that much better. It could very quickly turn into a fixture of society.
Yeah, and the recitation of holy texts has been a way to preserve them and help with memorization. In the Vedas, in Islam, in ancient Judaism, and in Christianity. It's pretty interesting. I wanted to get Adam to read something I sent. Hope everyone's got a little chance to look at it. But I found this article from the Musical Quarterly in 1922 by someone named Clement Antrobus Harris, and I wanted Adam to read some of it because I think it sums up all these kind of ideas of music being a part of the other or the divine.
Interesting name, Antrobus, by the way. Never heard that one before. So on the divine origin of musical instruments and myths and scriptures. So to a musician, there is only one alternative to believing that music is of divine origin, and that is to believe that nothing is. It comes as such and one as a matter of course that poets, philosophers, and theologians in all ages and parts of the world should have spoken of music as the divine art, religion's handmaid, the voice of God to the soul, herald of life to be, the speech of angels, nay more, the speech of God himself, and sphere descended maid, to give, in the words of Collins, whoever that is, an idea to be found in the works of many, if not indeed most poets. Among those who have ears to hear, such passages as the following are but the apt expression of a truism. It is by the odes that the mind is aroused. It is by the rules of propriety that the character is established. It is from music that the finish is received. I want another harmony to be used by him when he is seeking to persuade God by prayer. Rhythm and harmony find their way into the secret places of the soul. Plato's Republic. Let us hear a strain of music, and we are at once advertised of a life which no man has told us of. Thoreau. Away, away, thou music, speakest to me of things which all my endless life I have not found and shall not find. John Paul Richter. The master puts into music the thoughts which no words can utter and the description which no tongue can tell. S.A. Barnett. Music is a power transcending all other means of expression of ideas and of listening what is most elevating in thought and feeling. Arthur Watson. The same idea is conspicuous in mythology, Egyptian, Greek, and Scandinavian. The sons and daughters of the Nile regarded several of their many gods as especially interested in music. Their temple chants they attributed to the goddess Isis. The Egyptian Menoros, or funeral chants, are believed to be the oldest music in existence. Osiris also was looked upon as a patron deity of song. In many representations, he is accompanied by the 9 female singers whom the Greeks subsequently transformed into the 9 muses, just as they transformed Osiris into Phoebus Apollo. Among 42 priestly books assumed to be the work of the god Thoth, there are 2 books of the singer. The god Bes, probably a foreign divinity borrowed from Babylonia or Arabia, was honored as presiding especially over dancing, music, and the cosmic art. That is apparently music on its more secular side. The Hellenic peoples personified music in Apollo, who learnt his art from the universal god Pan, and they attributed to it a miraculous power over the forces of nature. The Skalds held modern and Christian nations. The Skalds held that their music was the gift of Odin or Woden. Among more modern and Christian nations, the nearest approach I can find towards claiming a divine origin for specific melodies is in regard to the ancient chants known as Gregorian or plain song. If it is not expressly stated that these liturgical strains were made in heaven, the language used in regard to them, for instance in the preface of the altar hymnal, certainly implies something more than a merely human authorship. Nor can it be denied that the intensely devotional beauty of at least some examples, for instance the traditional music to the Sursum Corda, smooths the way to such a belief. The church historian Socrates, writing about AD 440, relates that in a vision St. Ignatius saw the Trinity in alternate chants, and the Venerable Father was so impressed with the method that he introduced antiphonal singing into the church at Antioch. This must have been, of course, about the end of the 1st century. Thus, a divine origin is claimed for the antiphony of the Christian church, if not for that of the Jewish, of the singing in which antiphony was a marked characteristic. It cannot, however, but strike a musician as strange that Ignatius should have recorded the method in which the celestial choir sang and not the music itself. Perhaps he was not musician enough to notice or be able to retain and record technical details. Even if he was, one of the strangest things about dreams and perhaps visions is the vividness on which one waking one recalls some particulars, often trifling, and the impossibility of recalling others. More probably, we are intended to understand that the heavenly music transcended anything possible to human voices or systems of notation.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
badass.
I thought that was really cool. You guys got any thoughts on that?
I read that earlier when you sent it, and I was like, man, this is like one of the best, like, comprehensive, like, statements about everything that I've been studying for the last 2 days, right there, all in one spot.
It was only a Google search away, man.
But it's true. It's like almost every ancient culture on the planet seems to have regarded music as the divine art, and it stood out from all of the other types of expression. And
Right.
I mean, whether it's, you know, the Hindu and Buddhist like approaches to Om, and how that the word Om is like, there are 2 versions of it, OM and AUM, and the idea that that is the sound of God creating the universe.
You have Shiva's
And,
dance, which brings the universe and brings movement into existence.
And then you've got, like, in the Bible alone, there are, I think, almost 1,200 verses in the Bible that mention music. It's like,
Wow.
and you've got, like, just like every culture, it is a universal language. It's like, and it's connected to mathematics, and that's where you got Pythagoras kind of being like, wait a minute here, like this is beyond just art. This is like, it's beyond just communication between humans. This is a system, some sort of system.
Right.
And the reason why I think it's kind of connected so well to religion in so many ways is because it's so systematic that it kind of laughs in the face at the idea that the universe is built on chaos. It kind of kind of hints in this really cool, abstract, artistic way that there's something that's designing the program.
That idea of harmony, of relations and correspondence. And we definitely can't escape our Western orientation. So that's like the combination of the biblical or Abrahamic traditions, and then also the classical pagan stuff from Rome and Greece. And of course, all of those mythologies are filled with music.
Absolutely. The first book of the Bible, the first sentence in the Bible talks about God's voice creating light. So to me, that's pretty freaking amazing that you've got that long ago, in these times that we think of as like super primitive, you've got the first thing written in this holy text that indicates an understanding of quantum physics, that the universe is made out of vibration and light.
Well, I want to add too that the Psalms, and I think possibly the Proverbs, they're meant to be sung, correct?
Yeah, Song of Solomon was the first Quiet Storm radio show, man. It was
First slow jam.
It was a book of nothing but sexy slow jams.
It is that, yeah.
Well, I think that's one of my favorite things about music too, is that you can break it down mathematically as far as you want, but you can't. It still doesn't explain the emotions that it evokes and the feelings that it evokes in us, and it kind of turns into like a chicken and the egg thing. Like, do we feel that way because there's some spiritual thing that's making us feel that way, or do we feel that way, or do we feel it's a spiritual thing because it's something that's ingrained in us that we're supposed to, we're instinctively feel a certain way? But there's no denying that it's stronger in bigger groups, and that it's stronger in certain environments, and it's pervasive to everybody on the planet.
Oh yeah, and it's legit, because I was kind of a late bloomer when it came to like experimenting with drugs or alcohol of any kind. I was pretty like straight laced and goody two shoes, and I was a worship leader and was in a Christian experimental band in high school, and my first psychedelic experiences were all driven by spiritual ecstasy that was kicked off in musical environments. I was kind of in this group that we were called Harmonium, and we were popular around Nashville, and this was when I was like 15 or 16, and man, we would like lose our minds on stage, and we were all church kids. Like, we were going into like these punk rock venues, and there were like these death metal, atheist, drug taking people who would see us on stage and be like, what are you guys on? And we'd be like, we're on Jesus, man. Blow their mind.
What are some of the other most biggest music stories in the Bible?
And they're all over the place. They're everywhere. Even in Genesis, besides the creation story, like pretty early on when it's listing like where certain things came from on our planet, is like Jubal was the guy's name who said he invented all the instruments and got his children to start playing them, and that's where the word Jubilee comes from. And
okay, I didn't know that. Interesting.
And I had a really kind of cool synchronicity happen today, y'all. There was So the next EP that me and Chris are working on for Great Grandson is called "At War with the Noonday Demon," and which I always thought was just like a more of a pop culture term from like the, like 17th or 18th century as a name for listlessness or like kind of subtle depression, anything that kind of makes you feel like being lazy. And but in my research today, I actually found out that was developed by one of the monastic orders, and that's the term they gave to the spirit that was like the King Saul would be bothered by, that caused him to get David to come play the harp to chase that demon away. That's what one of the monastic orders kind of came up with the name of the Noonday Demon, because it would be kind of around midday, apparently, in that story of King Saul, where he'd be like partway through his day and he would just kind of get depressed and kind of not want to have to deal with the duties of being a king. And he would get David to come play the harp, and that would chase that spirit away and kind of get him focused back on wanting to accomplish what he needed to accomplish for the day. So that was like super weird to like be like, we're doing our final mixes for that EP, like as we speak. And I named it that. And then in the research for this show tonight, I discovered the origin of that term, Noonday Demon.
Yeah. That's what happens with Conspirinormal.
Right. Bring on the synchronicity.
Yeah, and then within these Abrahamic traditions and within Judaism, you have the mystical traditions of Kabbalah. And within Kabbalah, I understand there's a whole lot of musical ideas. There's the idea that when we're talking about the word or utterance of God, that a lot of the Kabbalah see that as a much more musical concept than words as we know them.
Yeah, and a lot of their music is instrumental and very repetitious. It's very trance-inducing.
And I was reading today how that there's lore of a 22-stringed instrument, which has each note corresponding to a letter in the Hebrew alphabet, and that in the ancient temple, these choirs would actually be communicating through gematria, whole who knows what kind of information through the music.
Right, almost
so
like conversations, isn't it?
Yeah. So that kind of blew my mind.
That's
that
like
there would be two. There would be one on each side, which is like what the antiphony is, right? Isn't it like that whole thing we think about with the monks, where like one is like da, 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 da. It's that back and forth kind of thing.
Yeah, the call and response, right?
Yeah.
That plays into like a really cool understanding of exoteric and esoteric as well, where if you've got like a number system where you can kind of turn music into a language of its own without speaking or putting words to the music, then you can have people appreciating that music exoterically, while the priests or the people more in the know are actually getting a much deeper meaning out of it esoterically. Which that's kind of what Kabbalah was all about, right? Esoteric, mystical side of Judaism.
Yeah, it was kind of the hidden knowledge.
Right, and there's a lot of analogs to that in Islam as well, which has so many regulations against music, and we think of as being so puritanical. So these Sufi orders who really used music developed those ideas kind of, even further. And the idea is that, music is not just for pure aesthetic appreciation, that it's for understanding the kernel and the religious aspects in it, and that it's actually a way of, like within the poetry of like, we're like in Rumi, say how you have him talking about drunkenness or sexuality, but those things are meant to be actually about the yearning for God. So they actually would take it's weird that actually it's a way of I guess preserving some of the secular music, but they would see themselves as like actually transmuting this secular music or erotic poetry into something holy. So that's weird that it gets continued in that other Abrahamic tradition of Islam.
So if you set if to understand that if you set it to music, then it somehow becomes less base. It somehow becomes less vulgar. It becomes more holy.
No, I mean, no,
is that what
no,
kind of what they're?
No, it's an idea that even within poetry, that may be erotic or talking about drunkenness or whatever. Like the inner meaning is the way of transmuting and changing the profane into something something holy,
transcending.
Yeah,
kind of like tantric Buddhism. That's kind of like tantric Buddhism as well.
Yeah,
it's like all of these paths follow so many of the same things. It's like the Sufis came up with a term for their like ritual of whirling dervishing around to the music, where they have a word for it. I don't remember what it was, but it translates to being drunk in the spirit. And it's like, when I read that, I was like,
Wajad, spiritual ecstasy.
Yeah, spiritual ecstasy and being drunk, spiritual drunkenness. And I remember, like, my dad's church was always kind of chill, but I've got other relatives that are ministers and from a really Pentecostal background. And I've been in churches where I literally heard preachers yelling that it's time to get drunk in the spirit. And so it's like, it cracked me up when I read that some of those backwoods Southern preachers, if they knew freaking out.
Hey, they might have been Shriners, man. They might have known what they're talking about.
Well, it really makes you think that all these traditions come from a similar viewpoint or a similar source at some point.
So those are all the Abrahamic traditions, but of course we've got the classical pagan stuff, which is like full of music. So some of that, I mean, like Apollo, like Joel, you were talking about Apollo earlier, who I guess he came like right out of the womb and invented song itself.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's just so pervasive that it's kind of nuts. And the more that I've gone down this rabbit hole, the more it just absolutely makes sense to me that music was one of our first like elements of self-expression as a species. And that's like what, and you know, it could even function from the same source. Like there's so many different trails that could be a part of, whether it's like an advanced civilization on the planet before, and the remnants of that advanced civilization kept music intact in some degree, and took it into the different pockets that they were in to repopulate the planet. But it also could be like 100th Monkey, you know, type thing, where humanity like just kind of started to uncover this knowledge, and there was a tipping point where it just kind of like infiltrated our psyche on a mass level, no matter where you were on the planet. Because you see all those examples of inventors, like where somebody becomes famous for inventing a certain like new technology, and then it turns out that there were like 8 other people on the planet who were right on the verge of breaking that new invention.
Like 20 minutes later.
And none of them knew about each other.
Plus,
the collective consciousness.
Plus, it's not coincidence that Pythagoras, who is claimed to have discovered intervals in music, at least in the Western tradition, also is one of the few Greeks who believed that souls can move between bodies. So there's really something about music and communality between people and how kind of we're all in it together, I guess.
Yeah.
The folklore around Pythagoras discovering those intervals by hearing the blacksmith hitting on the metal and noticing the different pitches depending on how the hammer struck the metal. It's so fascinating to me how similar that is to the mallets smashing the nuts in the pot. But then also when you study the Islamic tradition, it's the same thing. Apparently Muhammad was walking down the street and heard some craftsmen doing their craft and noticed the different pitches, and he was so excited with this sudden comprehension of music that he started spinning in circles. Why the Sufis do the whirling dervish thing is based on that Muhammad was so excited and emotionally moved at understanding these different intervals and pitch and how it became music that he started spinning in circles.
I actually believe it's Rumi, actually.
Oh, my bad. Rumi, yeah, not Muhammad.
but yeah, it's the same everywhere. It's, I mean, and like our, we all have this Western orientation. So when Europe becomes Christianized, I guess the relationship between music and the church becomes pretty, changes from that pagan kind of tied to the cycles of the earth to much more of the domain of the church. So our canon that we've really inherited is from that time when, effectively it was a theocracy, and some things were preserved, but they were pretty much the only game in town besides folk music, which continued a lot of this stuff, but the church basically became the only game in town.
I'll tell you what, those hymns are catchy.
Oh yeah. But and within that though, we have, I mean, let's go back, because you talked about like Pythagoras earlier. The Western esoteric tradition is that hidden part of this Western civilization. So it carried on things from Pythagoras. And let's get into Pythagoras, because I think that's really got a lot of meat to it, with ideas of harmony and ratio and macrocosm, as above so below, that music, that the mathematical formulas in music are present everywhere else in the universe and are divine in themselves.
It is pretty wild to think that the basic tenets of Pythagorean math also work orally in music in general. It's a pretty wild coincidence, if it even is that.
And with color theory and light, it all comes back to vibration and light being the foundation of how our universe seems to be structured. Which to me gets even back. And, there's like a lot of stuff that I've been into recently suggesting how much the fathers of almost all the religions kind of were secretly probably involved in some psychedelic rituals and using psychedelic substances, and how you see all these weird mushrooms show up in all these stained glass windows in cathedrals. And my experiences on DMT and on psilocybin especially, times where I have these glimpses of like stuff that's way bigger than anything I've ever been taught, and like where I lose that sense of self and I'm connected to the entire universe. So
DMT especially
during these times when humans were less distracted by like technology and TV shows and Facebook and stuff, I feel like probably like really doing deep dives into trying to understand the universe. And people, Pythagoras would have been one of those people who I think very well, whether or not it was through actual psychedelic substances or through other forms of esoteric knowledge that can lead to psychedelic experiences, whether it be fasting or sleep deprivation, like, yo, you got to get in on this trip. Don't eat for 2 weeks. It's awesome. And we're like the cats in China who are hanging out in caves. You got the Gnostic gospel saying that those who pray in the darkness will see the light. And I think all of these traditions, the priesthood, or the people who were the keepers of the knowledge or keepers of the flame, probably were like letting each other know that, yeah, music and these principles, if you apply them to your life in certain ways, you're going to be able to get a download of truth. You're going to be able to get these downloads of information. And if they're all getting these downloads and they're comparing notes with each other, eventually they're going to come up with these systems, that make sense in multiple aspects of life, whether it be looking at just numbers through mathematics, looking at the intervals of music.
Well, I think there's certain ratios that are just universal regardless of what type of energy you're talking about. With like Pythagoras, his the basis of his stuff was like the 3-to-1 ratio, where you get the circle of fifths comes from, where that's like the perfect fifth, the perfect harmony. One of the most beautiful, least colored intervals that there is out there. I think that lines up with light energy and various other things. And you've got, the whole thing, it all boils down to ratios and things that just line up in a more of a universal pattern, not so much in a, I don't know, but it's still, nobody knows why, like, there's certain ratios that are out there, like the golden ratio and or why we recognize that 3-to-1 ratio as such a perfect harmony. And that I think that's where the spiritual element starts to creep in on Pythagoras' mathematical take to things, which is that's the part that intrigues me most about this whole thing. Just why we interpret certain things the way we do, and why certain things affect us the way that they do, and so strongly, and why they're so abundant in nature. There's no explanation for a lot of that as well.
And a lot of that is the number 7, and that corresponds to, I guess, his most important theory of music was this idea of music of the spheres. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? I don't think I can really articulate it as well. Someone else might be able to.
No, most of what I know about him is about the thirds, like the 3 being a big number, and the 3-to-2 ratio, and like the thirds and the circle of fifths and that sort of stuff.
Music of the spheres is only something I kind of understand very conceptually. I have a very strange understanding of it technically. I'm very prolific in my music creation, but I'm also like very rudimentary in my intellectual understanding of music theory. I tend to like have like this strange ability to like impulsively act intuitively in almost all of the music that I make. So like some of the like theory stuff, when I start looking at the math of it, I only kind of understand it in this rough-hewn like sort of way, where conceptually I can look at like drawings and graphs of color theory and be like, oh wow, I can kind of see how that, when I look at a scale next to it, it makes sense to me. But it's kind of, I have to work really hard to try to understand that stuff.
Right.
But
no, I totally understand. I think our non-musical guy will explain it to us.
Well, this is just from what I read today and yesterday, but it seems to me that like the way that they were describing it in what I read was that the music of the sphere, so each sphere has this kind of like, and it's not necessarily to be understood in some kind of musical way, although you could understand it, but it's almost like the resonance is specific to each sphere. So that there's a lot of the mathematical aspects to it, and there's some occult and esoteric aspects to it, and a lot of it has to do with the spheres being the planets.
Yeah, it's the planet. So it's that the mathematical relationships between the notes have correspondence,
right,
to the then understood relationships between the planets, the 7 heavens.
It seemed to me like it was almost some kind of like little mental kind of exercise for people at the time to kind of get their head around the universe or or some kind of cosmology. And Kepler, that I learned today, Kepler used the music of the spheres to kind of like to really kind of press his own theories about the universe. And we know that Kepler is one of the big movers of moving science forward and in understanding astronomy. And oddly enough, they do know that planets now can emit radio waves and do kind of have their own kind of music to them.
Sure.
So it wasn't necessarily this weird idea or weird crackpot idea. It actually has some basis in reality. And it's almost like it was just kind of like this quasi-scientific, quasi-magical point of view about what the resonance of the universe, essentially. There's that picture that's on there, and that's actually on, if you go to the Wikipedia page about Musica Universalis, which is also called The Harmony of the Spheres or the Music of the Spheres. There's a picture from the Renaissance that is interesting that shows the different spheres, the different tones, the muses on one side and the planets on the other. And at the very top, you have Apollo with his lyre.
God, I do have a couple like odd interpretations of some of that stuff that I think's kind of interesting. But sometimes I wonder if some of the music of the spheres and them trying to say that it was about the planets might have been a little bit of a smokescreen with the Western intellects not wanting to admit how much they were drawing from some of the Eastern ideas. Because I know that a lot of the number 7 and any talk of spheres in like Hindu and Buddhist traditions are talking about the 7 chakras.
Mm-hmm.
And how
well, there you go, micro, macro, yeah.
And how the different tones connect to the chakras and those being spheres. And I know that the whole Om, the OM is supposed to just resonate within the 3rd through the 6th chakra. It starts in your belly, the 3rd chakra, and moves up to your mouth. And the AUM is the large Om, and that covers the base chakra all the way up to the crown chakra.
Right.
And
that's the same. It's just that as above, so below kind of thing. The heavens and the ratio, and it being the same as what's down here in the human body, the
and then
atom cadman and all that.
An interesting connection to Freemasonry too is that the tone that planet Earth makes, if you take that note or that tone, which is not audible to the human ear, and go up 33 octaves, then you're supposed to be at middle C on the piano.
When we were just talking to Adam or Alan Greenfield about the rites of Mizraim, Memphis being based upon points in the body, almost like the points of chi for acupuncture or something. So yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna bring up. I don't know if you were planning on talking about this later or not, but there's a lot of discrepancy about where tunings, just general tunings for pitches, should lie. You know, the standard these days is 440, which is considered by a lot of experts to be very distant with what our mind finds most acceptable. And it was back in the day, there's various other tunings where I think it was like 438 for A or 444, and one of those, I think it's 444, that resonates perfectly with the molecular structure of water, which a lot of people use as a selling point for it, because we're mostly water, the Earth is mostly water. But possibly 438 is more closer resonance to the Earth's actual frequency that it emits in like a more of a astronomical kind of aspect. I don't know if you guys came across any of that in the research. I meant to look up some of the stuff earlier, but
yeah,
I kind of got sucked into all the stuff that you guys were throwing into the group chat and reading.
Yeah, we'll probably get into that, because I know that's been really like popularized recently too. In a lot of I think the part 2 we're going to do with this will be like music conspiracies. So there's the whole idea that there's a conspiracy to take us away from what it should actually be oriented around, and that somehow that lends to people being able to control us better with music.
It's like the Nazis started it or something like that.
Yeah.
That's the fireman prophet. He also says something about that.
But I mean, maybe there's something to it. But continuing on this kind of Western esoteric thing, before I want to talk about something that me and Joel were talking about earlier. But Adam, you've been kind of digging into how many of these classical composers were esotericists.
Oh well, yeah. I mean,
almost all of them.
I mean, the biggest one it was Mozart. He was the biggest one. The magic flute apparently had all kinds of Masonic imagery. In fact, it was really just a Masonic allegory. And Mozart was just huge in Freemasonry. It was very much a part of his life. His father had been a Freemason. He played in the lodge. He actually apparently knew Adam Weishaupt, who started the Illuminati, oddly enough. And so he had all these kind of connections. You've got other guys like Debussy. So he was in the kind of like the same kind of occult milieu as like Eliphas Levi in Paris at the time, late 19th century. Richard Wagner would be another one. You know, all this stuff that's very like just very steeped in like occultism, Freemasonry, Germanic mythology. Stravinsky was another one I think I was reading about today that he was a part of it. So yeah, a lot of the guys and Johann Sebastian Bach was a Freemason apparently. Beethoven is suspected of being a Freemason. I mean, it was very popular at the time, but I think a lot of these guys, they probably really put some of these concepts and some of these musical structures into their music as well.
Absolutely. And I'm happen to be friends with this guy who is like the official organ player for the Grand Lodge of the Freemasons in Nashville. He plays organ for all their rituals in the Grand Lodge, and I've talked to him about pipe organs a couple of times, and he kind of turned me on to like some information from this guy who is an electrical engineer professor named Eric P. Dollard. And you know, if you guys haven't looked into Eric P. Dollard, I definitely think you should. The guy is an absolute wild man, and he's super smart and super crazy. But he believes in the electric universe. He's kind of in on the whole Thunderbolt project people and the idea that the universe is made out of electricity, and that the sun is actually electrical, not plasma based, and some of that stuff's really far out. But my favorite stuff that he's ever talked about is music. And he and some of his buddies, they go to a lot of the old cathedrals with the super complex pipe organs. Some of these pipe organs have like 30,000 pipes in them, and they tend to be tuned to 432. But he says that all of these, a lot of this classical music that they'll, in these cathedrals around the world, they'll still have these special concerts where they'll have people come in and do these famous classical pieces on these pipe organs. And he and his buddies will take these field trips, and they sit in very specific places in the room that he theorizes that the whole cross in the Christian church has to do with sound, and how if you sit in a room that's a certain shape and you sit in the place where if the foot of the cross was at the podium on the stage, and you find where the cross, the horizontal cross beam would go, and you go and sit right at that cross section, that when these pieces of music are played on the pipe organ, that it'll almost instantaneously catapult you into a psychedelic experience where you will have an out-of-body experience. So he and his buddies go to these concerts on these pipe organs. They'll take trips each year to these cathedrals just to sit in these places and for 3 hours during these big concerts on these pipe organs, and like have the most extreme out-of-body experience, the psychedelic experiences they've had in their life, without any drugs, without any like fasting or sensory deprivation. They'll just go sit in the spot, and they say like 20 or 30 minutes in, they feel the molecules in their body like moving around in different ways. And then
wow,
boom, all of a sudden they're hanging out in the ether.
Whoa.
And not to mention, these cathedrals would be built in specific ways on top of ancient sites or water or geological phenomenon. So you have all this adding to something like that, potentially.
The whole water connection is super fascinating to me too, because I went through a phase where I was really into the research of Dr. Emoto and how the research of water crystals and looking at the shape of them based on what the water was exposed to. And he had a whole run of his research that was where he would take this distilled water and put it in front of the speakers while certain types of music was playing, and then flash freeze it, slice it, and then look at the ice crystals and the shapes they formed in while that music was playing. And it's super fascinating because a lot of those classical pieces that were composed by these that music, and he looked at the ice crystals of that water, they would look like snowflakes. They would be beautifully, geometrically shaped and balanced and constructive. And then he would like put the water in front of like a lot of modern kind of discordal stuff and like heavy metal, and the ice crystals would freeze and like in chaotic pattern, without pattern.
Yeah, I've heard about
like
this.
Blobs.
Yeah.
And bodies are like 70% water. And so it's like, I think music actually is the foundation of magic in a way. It's the simplest form of magic, or the simplest definition I've ever heard of magic is action at a distance. And music travels through the air and can affect things that are so far away from its actual source.
Yeah.
So I think like music in and of itself might be the highest form of magic.
Those type of same experiments have been done with plants too. Like plants thrive under a certain type of music, and some other music they'll just die.
Heavy metal kills them.
Yeah.
Well,
It's
even
like
looking
the heavy
at like
metals in our drinking water.
even looking at like children learning, and children learn better when Mozart is playing than when something, even some of his peers are playing, classically. Like they're not even necessarily a style or a genre,
Yeah, if you had Salieri playing, it would probably not be as good.
Right.
If the cathedrals were built that way, that's why I was asking earlier if you were talking about the temple in Memphis. The Egyptian temple is like, my understanding is that some of the temples in Egypt and a lot of the classic cathedrals were kind of built to be a larger version of the human body. And so the music, if the music would resonate in a certain positive way in that building, then it was assuredly also going to resonate in the bodies of the congregants who go to those services.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that in and of itself, the as above, so below kind of effect. You've got a double effect going on there between the bodies and between the representation of the body.
The heavenly bodies.
Yeah.
Pretty wild stuff. I mean, before, while we're still in the past, because I want to make a bridge to our present time, but is there anything else anyone wants to talk about with kind of the origins of music, ancient music, and magic in our and other cultures having to do with how it interacts with the spiritualities, etc.?
I did notice that the drawing of the word for Om in the Hindu tradition, the symbol for Om, it looks almost exactly like the Sanskrit word for voice of God that is used in the Islamic tradition. In the Islamic tradition, it's kind of turned on its side in one.
There's some weird effects going on. I don't know if anybody else is hearing that when you talk, Joel. But
I heard that
what
too.
is that? It's like some alien transmission or something.
It's
like a woman's voice. Yeah, it's like a woman's voice starts talking. Like, what? There it is again. Like what?
I am very in touch with my feminine side.
Well, yeah. Maybe it will be caught on the recording. Perhaps not, though. I think I may have it.
Hopefully. I am known to wear dresses every now and then.
It's just like some woman's voice going, and then it just leaves, and then what's going on?
Some John Peel stuff.
Yeah, I know. You've been having any strange occurrences happening lately? Any weird phone calls in the middle of the night?
I think Joel has them all the time.
I've had a lot of weird synchronicities this week, I'll tell you. I'm reading, this is a little off subject, but I mean, the synchronicities that have occurred, that one about the noonday demon happened today. 3 days ago, I found out that me and my brother, who lives in Los Angeles, are reading the same book, and neither of us had ever mentioned it to each other. We got on the phone together for the first time in months, and he brought up the book he's reading, and it's the exact same book I started reading a week ago. And, there was one other one that just occurred today. Oh, right before this call happened, me and Chris were talking about a guy who played drums in a band I was in before. We went on a little run to pick up some beer from the gas station. We were talking about him. I left my phone here at the studio to keep charging to make sure that my battery was full for this whole conversation. And we get back from the store, and that guy, that drummer, had texted me while we were talking about him.
All right. Yeah, that's what happens when you get on Conspirinormal, guys. Echo gets turned up to 11.
Well, did we want to mention anything about like the Dionysian rites and like Pan and these type of things like this?
Yeah. I mean, we kind of skipped over some of the classical mythology. Adam, if you want to touch on any of that, I definitely want to get into that, because that, in tandem with the Abrahamic traditions, that's kind of what we are as Western people, is that amalgamation of those two traditions, it seems like.
Well, I mean, obviously, I mean, I think the Dionysus, what is he usually? I mean, it's the music. Music is more associated with Apollo, but I believe that music is associated with Dionysus, especially with the Dionysian ritual. I think drumming was very important for that as well. And it was probably the same in like the worship of Pan. Flutes, Pan is usually associated with the flute. So, I mean, there's music that is very important in both, I guess, kind
and
of
of course
sects,
with
I suppose.
I kind of think that
So
that's
that's
the
the
ubiquitous,
other side.
the ubiquitous nature of how all that stuff's taught. In terms of like actual style of music and Western music, like I tend to think that all the stuff that has influenced us in the church and this, growing up Christian and the Western scale and all that stuff, it's still very much connected to those pagan like concepts, I think, because, so much of Christianity and the rituals within the church were kind of, for lack of a better term, bastardizations of pagan rituals that already existed when the Roman Empire decided to make that switch.
Yeah, or preservations, if you can look at it that, like that.
Yeah,
there
sure.
was actually an esoteric system created with the with Christianity taking over.
But
I've got to
there is an
admit,
as far if we're trying to see if there's anything about the distant past that we haven't covered, one thing that I haven't mentioned that I've thought about a bit over the last couple of days is how much rhythmic drumming and going into trance states with drumming and dancing was a huge part of tribal life and all over Africa. But connected to that whole idea of going into those trance states through music, connecting people with a higher knowledge would be like the Dogon tribe. The Dogon tribe in Africa did a lot of rhythmic dance and circles for hours, very much like the Sufis. And, they're kind of famous for like having all this understanding about the cosmos that predated
and even
technology.
Even Celtic people, there's plenty of traditions that have been preserved with drumming, and we tend to be a lot more, of course, before popular music here that came from America in particular, mostly because of African Americans, is we tended to be more melody oriented, but the drum was probably before that or at the same time as the first kind of primordial singing.
I mean, my roots are I'm Scotch Irish, but for some reason, when it comes to Celtic art, I just don't buy in. I don't know why. I don't know if it's my rebellious nature, but I just have never been drawn to any type of Celtic art, whether it's the knots or Irish music. I just kind of reject it in a way. Maybe that's some self-loathing.
Yeah, none of that high lonesome sound, man. None of that high lonesome sound.
Country music is basically Irish.
That's true, but even my favorite parts of all that stuff is that it was actually white people stealing it from Africans. Like the banjo came from Africa for sure.
Well, yeah, but I mean, a lot of that high lonesome sound and the intervals. We talked on our last show about how a lot of it can sound. There's been a lot of parallels made to Eastern music and Middle Eastern music and Indian music with the
That's
droning
true.
of the bagpipes, of the big jumps and the melodies, and but that also might have a lot of interaction from Iberia. Yeah, it's
And
interesting.
the pedal steel being invented in Hawaii by a
Oh wow, yeah, I didn't think about that. The pedal steel is Hawaiian.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's all connected. I'm mostly just I'm just kind of goofing off at this point, just saying that
Yeah.
I can't stand Irish pub music.
Oh man. Oh man. Oh well. Well,
There's one Pogue song I like.
oh shit. Yeah. Was there anything else you want to add to that, Rob, before we get on to our modern day?
No, I think we covered everything I'm aware of or knowledgeable about.
Well, just to add something about the Greek mythology, and then there was another rite, the Orphic rite, Orpheus, which relied very heavily on music. So you've got three different kind of rites that are based in the Greek religion, Greek mythology: Pan, Dionysus, and the Orphic rite. So those are
and
all.
Orpheus,
and those
I
those
guess,
are more of a mystery school religion.
And Orpheus was said to be the greatest of all poets and musicians. And I think,
Right.
so I think that he really, let's see here. Well, I think Apollo was the one who had several musical battles, though. Like he went around, he battled Pan, whooped Pan. I think he whooped a couple other demigods. Yeah, it's like ancient hip hop battles, man. It's pretty cool.
There are, now that I think about it, I read something today that I thought was super fascinating that said that in a lot of the Vedic traditions, the weapons that the gods were using in their sky battles were often described as sound weapons or musical weapons.
Interesting.
And I thought that was super fascinating. And then also
isn't there some walls of Jericho to that?
The Walls of Jericho is really a cool little old school connection to the force and power of music. Also, there was something I read today about how King David, even when he wasn't playing his harp, he would sometimes, when he would want to pray or meditate or receive visions from God, he would set his harp in a window opening and wait for the wind to blow across the strings, and how the sound of the strings vibrating would help him enter into that meditative state. Just so many. I mean, I felt at a certain point today, I kind of felt overwhelmed. There's just even though I knew how pervasive to some degree music was connected to mysticism, I feel like I could spend months researching this stuff and keep finding new little factoids that kind of blow my mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
The search would be never ending, essentially.
Or in 1939, there was this Swiss researcher who mostly did research in India, but then wound up having a buddy say you should come to Tibet. And while he was in Tibet, he claims to have seen these Tibet monks levitate huge stones using these big kettle drums and 9-foot trumpets and a collection of monks who were chanting. And they would they set up the instruments in a certain pattern and had measured the distance. It was very mathematical. They had to set up in a certain location, a certain distance from the stones, and that after 10 or 15 minutes of them chanting, hitting these drums and blowing these horns, these big stones started to kind of shake back and forth, and then eventually they rose up from the ground and they levitated them 250 meters up onto a shelf on a cliffside. And this Swiss doctor of some kind said he sat and watched them for hours doing it, and said he had never seen anything like it, and he knew.
Well, you've got.
He said he knew that no one would believe him when he told the story.
There's also Coral Castle.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
The owner of that was this little skinny guy, and somehow he built this castle out of these large stones, and people would say that they would hear like these harmonies at night and a lot of music coming from the coral castle. And there would be the next day a new stone would be erected. So that's always been like kind of like that speculation among the paranormal field, is that somehow he was using some kind of sound technology to levitate these stones.
Yeah, I mean, there's like a lot of examples, even in modern technology, of acoustic levitation on a small scale. But the idea of like these monks causing large stones to go 700 feet in the air is pretty wild.
Yeah.
But I also think I'm also like, I'm a very open-minded person. So I think like if there's a group of people who have been studying a tradition and a practice for thousands of years and they've kind of honed in on it, like it wouldn't surprise me at all if it was absolutely true. I mean, that might be, that dude who did Coral Castles consistently said that he had discovered the secrets of how they built the pyramids in Egypt.
Yeah, he did say that. Yeah. So that's even going way back. That's even going way back into the history of music. Did they use music somehow to do the megalithic buildings and all that? Yeah.
It very well could be. If the heroes and gods within the Vedic traditions were using music as weapons, then certainly that same type of energy or power could be used more constructively. And then you've also, there's lots of stuff and lore around the Nazis developing sound weapons and sound cannons. And, so many things. If the universe is made of frequency and sound, then it seems like sound could be a force that could manipulate any tangible substance on the planet. If it can, like some people think that that's how, like, there's certain megalithic structures that look almost like the stones were melted and reshaped and to fit in these like crazy jigsaw patterns of these stones that there's no chisel marks or whatever. So maybe they were able to like hit those stones with certain frequencies and it changed the structure of the stone molecularly to a point where it was almost like putty, and they could reshape it, and then they stop hitting it with the frequencies and it re-solidifies.
Well, if the utterance or the word of God is some kind of musical frequency, then employing that would be having the power of the gods to do things like build these things. And if the gods supposedly built these things, then there you go, right? That is the ultimate powers that are lost for eternity. So, I guess breaking from ancient antiquity, I guess we could get into things that are a little bit closer to home for all of us, and things that are really uniquely American too, and really just have their origin here in popular music, in which what we really mean, I guess, is recorded music. And this is what has shaped all of, I know all you guys, I know we've all grown up in music subcultures, and pretty much these things shaped who we are. And I guess at the beginning, really, if you want to talk about the beginning of rock and roll and all these things, there is a foundational mythology, and that's probably the crossroads myth of Robert Johnson.
Oh, absolutely. I forgot that you and I talked about that on the phone the other day. Like where he had the whole idea of selling your soul to like gain this important knowledge, which happened to be like being able to be a motherfucking badass on the guitar. But there's a long tradition of rock and roll musicians talking about having sold their soul in some way or another. There's a really interesting interview I remember seeing with Bob Dylan, where he kind of grins real big, and he's like, well, I had to make a deal with who to get to the top. After looking at all this like more ancient knowledge and esoteric stuff about music, it kind of makes a lot of modern music seem so dull and boring.
Well, I don't know. I mean, because I want to start off with that Crossroads mythos, and then of course a lot of the people who've been making popular music have fascinations with the occult. We're going to get into kind of the more conspiratorial stuff on probably the next episode because there's tons of that. But just this idea that popular music is bringing all these old forms of ritualistic music we were talking about, like back to the West, and this definitely through African Americans here more than anything, and through the musical traditions that they've preserved, and a much more emphasis on rhythm. And if you look at a modern festival or rock concert, these seem like Dionysian rites or ancient pagan fertility things going on. Like, is this the return? This is the return to that stuff. And maybe if you're fundamentalist, like maybe a lot of these fundamentalists really aren't wrong in that this really is the return of elements of paganism.
Oh, it's sure, and then you got to put in the element too, like we talked with Tony Kail about hoodoo and all that, and how that was kind of the original satanic panic was really the panic over hoodoo and what that was, and of course then this is the 30s and 40s, and then all of a sudden the 50s, 60s you get rock and roll music that's based in African American music, and then from that comes heavy metal, and then you get the satanic panic later on in the 70s and 80s. So, these different, it's all about the racial structure and all about that. So that's another element. Like there's another religious aspect that is the African religion.
No, the people running, I think, like entertainment industry and whatnot, I think probably are into esoteric stuff to some degree. And the problem I have with a lot of the modern culture embracing is it seems so dumbed down. It reminds me of like the Catholic Church kind of using humans as batteries and kind of like not wanting to allow the common people to be able to speak Latin. I feel like it's all kind of being like ushered in through the modern entertainment industry in ways that are a little bit kind of like crappy and like nefarious maybe. It's like getting people to buy into something that they don't even understand what they're buying into. And
oh, for sure.
I don't particularly like that. And I like the idea of esoteric knowledge being brought to light. And like my favorite part of anything having to do with the Christian mythos at all is the idea of the curtain between the people and the Holy of Holies being torn. And so anyone who's still trying to like operate and controlling humanity through esoteric means without actually bringing that into the actual face-to-face conversation, I feel like it's kind of a scumbag.
It's empty. It's very, very empty.
But I do see like those symbols. You see it in like the halftime shows of the Super Bowl, and like people like there are people out there who make a living off of breaking that down and how it's all a pagan ritual. And maybe it is, maybe it isn't.
Well, no, I mean more of like the actual what's actually going on in culture. I mean, how we actually have we re-inherited some of these mysteries through rock and roll, through dance, through pop culture. I mean, this was like, good people did not do these things that we all have been shaped by, in our youth. I mean, this is...
Well, that's what I was going to say. Like, it even goes back to like, I was going to talk about rock and roll, but it goes back to like even, in the 1800s, the waltz.
Yeah.
Like, a lot of the upper crusty people, the adults of society back then, they were like, they saw the waltz as this like horrible thing with young people dancing close to one another, and like, they saw it as a devilish influence. That was 100 years before rock and roll. But I think that's kind of the whole thing is any use of music that has drawn people towards that experience that's not associated with the church has been called sort of a demonic or a devilish kind of a thing. And it's
like
it predates rock and roll by a long shot, but rock and roll has made it popular to us, to our generation, to our parents' generation in particular. But
it's weird.
I was reading, and I was talking to Adam about this like a week ago. I always forget that guy's name, the
Ambrose Bierce.
Ambrose Bierce, thank you. He wrote a book about, and it was very tongue in cheek. He was not against it, but it was about waltz music in what would have been like the 1860s, and it was almost the plot was almost the same as Footloose. It was like hilarious, but it was just all about music drawing people away from creating a spiritual experience that wasn't associated with the church, essentially.
Yeah,
Right.
I think it's not just the church in some ways. It's also the state, and being able the state being able to control people as well. I mentioned Stravinsky before. When the Rites of Spring, when he premiered that, people had never heard anything like it, and they just went crazy.
Here's going back even further to Plato. This is the famous Plato quote: "For the introduction of a new kind of music must be shunned as imperiling the whole state, since styles of music are never disturbed without affecting the most important political institutions."
What were you going to say, Rob?
Plato?
Yeah, that's Plato.
Wow, that's pretty far out.
So our entire
Plato was apparently a Pythagorean secretly. I read about that today. Like some British researcher found a code in all of Plato's writings where every 12th line that he wrote mentions music, and he was kind of giving a nod to the fact that the Pythagoreans used a 12-note scale, and he was kind of letting them know, like, I'm on your side, but I can't like admit it publicly, or I might get killed.
Wow. And so our whole last century was about, the entire pop culture of it was about constant innovation and new kinds of music.
Yeah, and I love that. I mean, I love new kinds of music. I just feel like in a pop culture sense, there is some element of like the divisions between the esoteric and the exoteric have gotten more stringent.
Well, I mean, do you feel like it, and I've experienced this sometimes too, I'm not going to lie. Do you feel like it makes things profane? Like it takes away the kernel of it, even though that might have been the thing that allowed you access to these things. Sometimes
what I feel
it feels
like
things
the
are
powers
cheapened.
that be, the different factions of the powers that be are taking this thing that is sacred and beautiful and universal and potentially what humanity for thousands and thousands of years has been our primary connecting point to whatever divinity means, and they're like having pissing matches over who can use it the most to control the masses, or like monetize it or corporatize it. And to me, like, that's the most profane thing that could ever be done to something as beautiful as music.
Oh, absolutely. And sometimes something good bubbles through, something with meaning and something that's got it manages to become popular, and it still has a spiritual value to it, or like a esoteric value to it, or a some kind of connection to that other. And but for the most part, I think you're right. I think it is totally a battle over who can. It's a powerful thing. Of course, they're going to grab it and they're going to try to use it. It's a tool.
It's the same way that like governments use nuclear weapons in the past.
It's the same way it's the same way governments use religion. It's identical to it.
They see that there's
like
a power
religion
there,
in itself.
They wanna...
Religion in itself isn't a bad thing, but when it gets intertwined with a religion, which it always does because it's a powerful thing, it becomes this whole other, like, I don't know. It gets watered down. It gets abused. It gets used as a tool, and it winds up affecting everybody in the long run negatively, the same way that the music industry has. Just to wrap that up, music in itself is the most sacred thing in the world to me. So when I see like pop music taking advantage of that, and you know, there's an office of people in LA that are deciding what the next like lyrics for One Direction's new hit single should be. Like that's just like, it makes me sick. the same way that like when I see religion being utilized that way, like makes me sick. It's the same thing.
Chris hasn't talked much, and he's got something.
I was just gonna say, isn't the spirit of that Plato quote you read earlier, though, doesn't that speak to how much people in power fear music and its power to
Oh, absolutely.
transcend? Because, like, you know, we're talking about how terrible a lot of garbage pop music is, which of course it is, but really good music seems to endure no matter whether it's the CD or Spotify or whatever kind of like profit-driven structure tries to control it. It seems like good music endures, and those kind of come and go with the tides or whatever.
And in 100 years, the best music is what's going to be remembered. But like even like I have two daughters. My 14-year-old, she's in the past year or two, she's got really into like 90s music. So whenever we're sitting around listening to music, she'll play like Nirvana or I don't know, some Red Hot Chili Peppers or something from the 90s, and like she genuinely loves it, you know. And it's that to me, that's inspiring. Like, it gives me a little bit of hope.
Yeah, Nirvana rules. We're working on a Nirvana cover right now.
Hell yeah.
Not a fan, but that's cool.
You got to admit they were influential, though.
Oh yeah. I mean, I can't fault that. But I mean, what I think a lot of this boils down to, though, is that this is a music. When we were going back into the ritualistic past, it was much more of a participatory thing. And what mass media has done is it's created these stars as these objects of worship, and they're kind of like fulfilling the roles of the heroes of old. And
well,
so now,
and they've done it through nefarious means by boiling down what is most attractive to most people, and let's give them that. And there's no substance to it. There's no there's no spiritual value there whatsoever. None. It's watered down. It's meaningless lyrics. It's catchy stuff. It's catchy rhythms. Like this kind of rhythm works. This kind of melody works. Like that's not what.
It's formulaic.
And as much as you might dislike Nirvana, they were creating things from the heart that they were feeling, not trying to get popular. They were trying to create. You know,
right.
and I think the very aspect of trying to create in itself, it introduces an energy that it exposes us to a more of a spiritual, like a genuine truth.
But
that
some of
otherwise
those,
is therefore lacking.
Some of those great musicians from the 70s, the really epic ones who we would love and stuff. I mean, at the time, you know, the punk rockers hated Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd and that shit, and they were like, this is not rock and roll. This has elevated these people to these like hero worship, and we need to bring it back down to earth. So I think in some of the music from the 80s, you saw this deconstruction, and you saw this return to like a communal participatory thing, to the point where I think with some of the electronic dance music, you see that it wasn't even about, you know, looking at a stage. It's about your participation in this type of ritual. And it's about the audience and all of our participation instead of this hero worship.
Well, the hedonistic elements of it got more pronounced, for sure.
Very much so.
But they were always pronounced, right? You're talking about Dionysus, baby.
That's right. That's very true. They were probably dancing.
Yeah, but if you're looking
a lot.
My thought is that, the 70s, it was more about the message. It was more about the creating of something, about the sharing of something. You know, it wasn't like, you can even go back further. You can look at the 50s. Like the stuff that got popular was what they could sell to someone that owns a jukebox. You know, because it was the jukebox owners that controlled the music industry. And you know, you had the bubblegum pop music and all of that kind of transferred into the 60s. But then you also had the underground scene through all of it, which was a lot of it was inspired by, you know, psychedelics.
Yeah. Yeah, and then that's a big part of it too.
And psychedelics
core
has always
point of
helped
what
us
I'm
break
saying-
apart from. Well, I was just gonna say the psychedelic element has always helped break apart from that commercial side of it. The what is most marketable, what is most hip, what is most this, what can we sell today? Because it engendered a whole group of people to just create, to just like, I want to make this because I want to make something. I'm not trying to be rich. I'm not trying to be popular. I'm not trying to be famous. I want to create something that genuinely means something, you know.
Right.
And those are the bands that have endured throughout.
Yeah,
Like,
and if you become
you
become famous, so be it. But you're still doing it because you love to do
right.
it.
And you've got some pop music that has endured, but the pop music that has endured also had those elements, right? They happened
Sure.
to have stumbled upon those elements, or they happened to, like, it's not because some record label thought this is like the great thing that's gonna, you know, those are never the bands that endure. Those are never the bands that continue on into the future, or that influence the next generation of artists, of true artists. So you get this like dichotomy of like stuff that can make money today and stuff that's gonna influence people tomorrow, but still be beneficial to society in some sort of way, you know.
I think the difference is that back in the day, it seemed like the people who were like making the majority of the music were the people who were like tapping into the esoteric stuff and were doing so intentionally. So I think like,
yeah,
we want to talk about like the music, this instrumental music being made by the people studying Kabbalah. They were like making this music that might have had these secret codes behind it. And sure, some people were just kind of listening to it and being like, oh, it's beautiful, praise the Lord. And then other people, though, might have been like, whoa, I'm kind of noticing this and this about this music. And so the people making that music would see certain young people who were recognizing these universal truths within the music and being like, oh, you're a sharp person. Let me like pull you into the mystery school, or this like thing where we're going to teach you like some stuff that really needs to last for thousands and thousands of years.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
I don't
Is
really
this a
see,
continuation?
I don't really see that. I just don't see that people are in the system now being like, oh, you picked up on that secret message in that Post Malone song. Let's like have you like.
Well,
let's, like,
I
bring
don't
you
mean
into
like
this
the
inner
top.
knowledge.
I don't mean the top of the pops, man. I mean just like popular culture itself, which would include things that we would say would be underground, etc. And I definitely have a much more of a Generation X orientation. So I'm talking about things like punk rock, things like underground DIY, heavy metal, and the early rave scenes. These things being this like continuation of these initiatory experiences that might have been, that are definitely tied up in psychedelics and things like that, that might be some kind of analog to the ancient mysteries of the past being like reintroduced to people now. And in the absence of coming of age rituals, in the absence of all these things that ancient societies had for people growing up, it seems like these music subcultures were ways of initiating young people into, even if it's just like fragmentary elements of some kind of ancient mystery schools.
No, I think
for
that's
sure. Like
a good point. That's what punk rock.
That's a very good point. Well, I came to like around 16 or 17. I got really into like the whole jam band thing. The Grateful Dead, Fish, that sort of thing, and they're very, very. Those bands are very community oriented. Very psychedelic heavy, very experience this the way you want to experience it. Sort of venues, and I know I'm alone on this podcast as far as this is concerned, but it embodies that whole experience. Like, I remember the first Dead show I went, like, it was post Jerry Garcia's death, but the first Dead show I went to, like, that was the most communal I've ever felt in my entire life, where I met all these people that felt like me, that loved music the way I loved, that were down to do psychedelic drugs and experience music in just whatever open way you can experience it, kind of a vibe, and I think that's much closer to the way people experience music hundreds of years ago or thousands of years ago than what most modern culture does.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know what I mean?
Well, and I mean, is that also like that really speaks to the power of music? Because even though us here during this conversation aren't the kind of people that want to go to Coachella and see Post Malone, to borrow Joel's example, the people who do go to Coachella to see Post Malone do feel that same communality around that. So I think there is something to be said for even what I would consider, quote unquote, music that doesn't really get me off or whatever. There is something that it does bring people together no matter what.
Yeah, so does sports does that. That's it.
Yeah, but that's religion too, isn't it?
Yeah, true.
Yeah,
True that.
totally.
People, they get together to try and.
I think the difference is back in the day, it was the pervasive music. It was the music that existed on almost every aspect of the culture. Also had a deeper meaning. People had to choose to deep dive into that to understand the deeper meaning.
Yeah,
now,
but
it's more like you have to find the subversive music you have to find totally different music than what's pervasive.
I'll be devil's advocate. I'll be devil's advocate though, because the popular music that we know of as classic rock and R&B is really only that. I mean, a lot of them are good bands and great musicians, but a lot of it, they were only hits because of the radio mob syndicate that ran that shit. And there's great bands that are unsung because of that. And the only reason we know of a lot of the music we know of is because of that fixed, corrupt system. It's the same thing.
And that's what I'm saying. But some good stuff does bubble through to the surface.
Yeah.
You know, we don't still listen to most of the stuff that was promoted back then. We still listen to 5% of the stuff that was promoted back then because it actually was good. And we won't hear the stuff. We won't hear, 95% of the stuff that was phenomenal back then. You'll never hear it. No one will ever hear it. It was played in a garage somewhere and it never got picked up by a label or whatever. But like,
right, but
that doesn't devalue the few things that did bubble through that happen to also be good.
Right, but there really aren't many people I know, like under the age of 30, who truly have sat down and listened to much Frank Zappa, and that's some of the most like esoteric rock and roll that there is. I don't particularly like it. I don't like Frank Zappa like aesthetically, but when you listen to his interviews and the stuff that he's putting behind the music, I'm like, man, that's pretty dope.
Right, I listen to it from an educational standpoint, but not because like I need something to jam out to.
Well, he did say don't eat the yellow snow, so there you go.
I mean, there's a lot of wisdom there.
Well, I think
there is indeed.
Yeah, I think we've kind of wrapped it up and gotten to modern day and personal experience and things like this. Maybe we can just say though, what role does the supernatural, esoteric, paranormal play in all of your musical lives? Or how has it been a part in your personal experience in creating music and listening to music? I mean, we've all touched on it, but if there's anything else you guys want to add with that for just like personal anecdotes.
Yeah, I'll start for sure. Music to me is the most real thing that there is. Everything else is secondary. It always has been since I was like a little kid. And I will always create music because it's a way to express emotions that you can't express with words by themselves. And I think if every musician felt that way, the world would be a better place, because that's what music is for. It's for expressing esoteric concepts that are ingrained in our psyche. They're ingrained in our instincts. They affect us in ways that are so deeply ingrained in our history, thousands and thousands of years back, that there's just no other way to communicate on that kind of a level. So that's why I've always been into music. That's why I will always be into music. And thank you for letting me on the show, Sergio and Adam.
It was awesome. as a non-musician, I would second that. Just it's all for me, being someone that doesn't make music, has no musical skill. It's just for me, it's just all about how it makes me feel, and the words. That's it for me. So yeah, I second
what's
that.
music? What's music without listeners? So
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we're all listeners, right? That's why we all love music. Doesn't matter if you make it or not.
And I guess
For
we'll go
me-
on to you, Joel.
you know, music's always been, I feel like, my therapist. I'm also like
Yes.
kind of autistic, and I feel like it's one of those things that somehow helps me connect with the rest of humanity. It's kind of been a bridge for me since I was a child, but then also connected to my upbringing. It's the only part of anything that had to do with my religious upbringing that hasn't degraded. Almost every other aspect of religious influence in my life has degraded and turned to dust, but music has only become stronger and greater and more relevant to how I view the world. And it's been my best friend through ever since I've decided to be like a dedicated psychonaut. It's like so connected to like every experience I've had that feels bigger than just being a lone individual on this planet. It's how I find camaraderie with friends like Chris right beside me and with people like you guys. It's like the language of all languages, and it bridges the gap of all different societies, and it does hold a lot of esoteric keys to understanding things that we haven't been taught, and I think also understanding how the world operates. And I think learning how to listen. I think learning how to listen is one of the most important things to experience as a human being, whether it's listening to your lover and what their needs are, or listening to your friends and your family members, or listening to politicians spout bullshit, or listening to your favorite records. I think learning to listen is one of the most important skills to have as a conscious being. And once you learn to listen properly, you also can learn to express yourself properly in a way that will cause other people to listen. And I think that music has taught me that more than anything else.
Wow.
Yeah.
Those were pretty profound statements, guys. We really appreciate it. I'm really glad I got you guys on here.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, it's a pleasure to be involved, and man, it's super cool to be involved in an episode where Rob is back on the show.
Yeah.
I've been going into the back catalog a lot, like especially during quarantining. I take a bath every day. I like draw a bath with Epsom salt and put on some incense and put on Conspirinormal and listen.
Yeah, there you go. I like it.
Hold on. Surfiel, you're not getting off that easy. What does music mean to you?
Oh.
Yeah, and we gotta hear the same from Chris.
Yeah.
Man, been absolutely. It's been a large part of my life. Like I alluded to, I think I was the tail end of a generation that the entire cultural life was pretty much regulated by music, and within it were all these mysteries to all kinds of ancient things and worldly things too, and political things and identity things. And when I did my psychedelic experimentation, some of my earlier musical tastes from my childhood came back, and I realized that a lot of what I was listening to was kind of this like social function based upon the subcultures I was associated with and things like that. So I got into just appreciating music for what it is and kind of trying to disconnect it from identity so much. But it's been a source of it was a source of so much brotherhood. Like I said, in the absence of these rites of passage, of brotherhoods or fraternal organizations and things like that, it is the thing that that fulfilled all those functions growing up, and it's a window into everything. So it's one of the most important things in my life to this day.
Chris, what's from you, man?
Oh, I was just going to say, just building off that, man. I mean, it's been the through line for this whole conversation we've been having over the past couple hours. Music is magic, man. And whether it's a song you've heard or a song you've written or a song you've been a part of, it almost seems like a spell that can do whatever you want. And it's just, I don't know, I don't want to ramble. It's just really something very, very special and something very mysterious.
It should be anyway.
Yeah,
absolutely.
That it is. Okay. Awesome, guys. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and close out the show, but before I do want to, we'll close out the show. We'll do the whole Conspirinormal stuff. Before I do, this is part 1. And in the next episode, I guess we will kind of pick up where we left off and talk about the modern day. Talk about, I guess all of us here will be more versed in more like rock and roll and rock music and all that. But we'll talk about some musical conspiracy theories, some weird unsolved murders, that type of thing, and really get into the weeds on that. So this was excellent. So guys, thank you so much for listening. I want to thank Joel, Chris, and Rob for being in. Surfiel, as always. And also, Surfiel, thank you for putting this together, man. This has been a great discussion.
Hell yeah, I'm very, very satisfied with this.
Yeah, great. So guys, just a couple of quick notes. Conspirinormal Patreon. If you want to become a patron, you can do so for as low as $1. We are doing weekly shows now on there, sometimes with guests, sometimes with ourselves. Just like the one we just did not too long ago was with Rob and Surfiel and myself. And then we've had a couple of guests with Recluse and with Mark Anthony Wyatt in the past. So we will have some more Patreon stuff on there. If you guys love the show, support us. Leave a review on iTunes. Give us a subscription on YouTube. And thank you so much, guys. And we will be back next time. Dr. Future is going to join us on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.